my name is Matt Dragonstone, and welcome to the Dragonstone podcast. It's a solo show today, and I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about Neptune. Pretty soon, Neptune is going to ingress into Aries. It's going to leave its home in Pisces and move house into Aries. And I think it's pretty significant that this big ingress is happening not only now in the middle of the 2020s, when it's coinciding with a bunch of other outer planets ingressing into different signs, but also I think that Neptune's ingress into Aries is significant because of the way that Neptune governs the vibe. And we'll talk a little bit more about the vibe and what that means over the course of the episode. But I've been thinking a lot about Neptune in Aries and thinking about Neptune astrologically in the past couple of weeks. I published an article on my Substack that I'll link to in the show notes about Odysseus and the sirens and a whole bunch of other things that kind of have a Neptunian flavor and were resonating throughout my mind. And so I decided to put them down in the form of an article. And today I just want to riff on some of the themes in the article and expand some of them out in a discussion of Neptune and Aries and Neptune and Pisces and the way that the ingress is going to change the discourse around a lot of Aries-related topics. So when we talk about Neptune, we're talking about dissolution, as in dissolving. So to give some context about Neptune as an astrological signifier, as a planet that is used in modern astrology, Neptune is about dissolution in a nutshell. It's about dissolving. It's amorphous and it's diffuse. You know, Neptune, the planet, is a gas giant. It's this big collection of gases. There's no real solid ground on Neptune itself. And as Neptune presents itself in astrology, it's kind of similar. There's no solid ground with Neptune, and it's like a cloud is kind of what I would say. Sometimes it's foggy, sometimes it's stormy, but that diffuse quality is something that Neptune brings to whatever sign it's in by transit and whatever sign and house that it's in by nativity. Neptune diffuses everything it touches and it blurs the boundaries. So when something like a concept or whatever gets diffused, it becomes difficult to describe that concept in precise language. So Neptune is best described in poetic or symbolic language. If you've ever tried to describe something Neptunian, you'll find that words fail you in terms of a straightforward explanation. But poetry and symbolism doesn't, and that's the best medium to communicate Neptunian things. So music and poetry and narrative, and importantly for today's episode, myth, do a better job of communicating what Neptune is all about. When we think about Neptune, we get a bunch of keywords that pop up, and I think one really good keyword is glamour. Glamour is another Neptunian word. And when we think about glamorous things and the way that glamorous things are presented to us on social media, for instance, but also in cinema and in art generally, glamour is kind of defined as just a little bit soft focus, just a little bit diffuse. A glamorous thing is not a warts and all revelation of all the good and bad. It's glazed over and it's filtered. So Neptune's glamorous and it's poetic and it's diffuse and it holds sway over the mythologies that we tell ourselves and how these contribute to identity. So if Neptune's diffuse and it's about dissolving stuff, it's been in Pisces for quite some time. And now right at the end of that transit through Pisces, we can kind of take a look back and see the way in which Neptune has dissolved and filtered and put a soft focus on Piscean things. So Pisces is already a little bit soft focused to begin with, but when we think about Piscean things, we think about things like drugs, about mysticism, about compassion, particularly about beauty. Pisces is where Venus has its exaltation, for instance. And we also think about things like illusion and disillusion. So thinking about the way in which Neptune has been in Pisces for about 14 years or so. Think back to 2011. We weren't really having the kinds of conversations around Piscean things that we are today. And just in terms of going through the list, when it comes to drugs, since 2011, we've all kind of fallen in love with drugs a little bit, arguably, right? So let's take ayahuasca as the big one. There's so much ayahuasca dialogue around the traps, around podcasts and around spiritual circles, and psychedelics generally will fall very, very distinctly into that category of Pisces, and in the past 14 years, definitely into a description of Neptune's transit through Pisces. So ayahuasca, 100%. I know a lot of people from all walks of life, like literally all walks of life, public servants, artists, creatives, sex workers, a whole bunch of different people who have all taken ayahuasca, this really previously obscure psychedelic entheogen. And also, on a lesser scale, mushrooms. There's a lot of psilocybin mushroom and amanita mushroom conversations that we're having, and it's more common now for people who kind of exist outside of the previous demographic for mushroom takers to be just casually mentioning that they dropped shrooms and had a massive trip. And then at the most common level, it's weed. Since 2011, weed has basically become legal everywhere in the English-speaking world to varying degrees, whether it's decriminalized or legalized for the purposes of prescription as a medicine, or just out and out, you're allowed to go down and buy some weed without a script. It's there at the moment. So drugs as a Neptune in Pisces signification have become much more a part of the everyday conversation. We also see with mysticism, astrology and tarot and magic are a big part of mainstream discourse now in the West, comparatively when you look at pre-2011. This is great news for me personally because I was labouring in obscurity until 2011, and it's nice to be out in the open a little bit, albeit temporarily. But it seems like everyone's weird aunt now has a bit more legitimacy because they're good at astrology, or they're good at tarot, or they're a reader, or what have you. But looking beyond those kind of surface level representations of Pisces and Neptune in Pisces, compassion has been part of the conversation now for a little bit. It never really left, but there's a particular type of Neptunian Piscean compassion that has entered the chat since 2011. And Neptune, in blurring distinctions, we can look at gender identity, for example, as one area where compassionate blurring of distinctions has resulted in a whole bunch of new laws and new discourses and new languages and new conceptual frameworks for discussing things like gender. There are now interstitial categories of gendered existence, and there are laws to support that, which is great. Beauty is another Neptune in Pisces kind of manifestation in the way that our relationship to beauty has changed. Look no further than Instagram. We're going to be talking about Instagram a lot because it's a very Neptunian sort of space. But the advent of technology-supported Neptune in Pisces takes on beauty have also been part of the landscape as well. Instagram filters and the way in which Instagram as a platform, as a social media platform, really does exemplify the ways in which perfect versions of ourselves are presented to the world, which are usually squeaky clean and which usually have fuck all to do with reality, which kind of brings me to disillusion and illusion. So Neptune in Pisces casts this glamorous, illusory, dreamy quality to Piscean things like we've discussed before. But there's a flip side to everything. Neptune doesn't just bring a dream, it can also bring disillusion as well. So social media, like I said about Instagram, it has absolutely no relationship to reality. It's something that we kind of step into as an alternate reality, basically, a second life, if you'll pardon the reference. But social media has this kind of arm's length, really weird connection to reality, and yet has an influence on the reality that we live in. If you've ever seen or gone to a nice tourist spot, which I've done, I'm so old to be complaining about this, but those damn kids doing their TikTok videos and influencers taking photos at all of these landmarks are a great example of the way in which a Neptunian illusion has, through social media, influenced how people act in reality. And so we've got this category of existence now, which was there before 2011, but not in the form that it's in right now, today in 2025, which is not that kind of one-to-one comparable to reality, and yet we're all addicted to it. We've got an online persona, and the idea of an online persona is a thing now. And 15 years ago, it really wasn't. We were having much more conversations face-to-face, and a persona was something that people kind of built up about you from real life or real world interactions. It doesn't matter these days if you really did something. Yeah, and social media's got this way of presenting a narrative that draws you into a story about an influencer, a personality, or a subject, where people appear to be more expert in areas or more representative of areas than they may be in real terms. So it doesn't matter if you've really done something, so long as you've got photos of it or images or videos of it, and it looks like you did. So Neptune is disillusion and lies, generally, is the name of the game. Neptune can kind of set you up so that you're not living in reality, but particularly so in Pisces. And Neptune is kind of at home in Pisces. Modern dignity systems and modern rulership systems in astrology will ascribe Neptune rulership over Pisces. I still adhere to an older version, which is Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius, but Neptune you can't deny that Neptune has this kind of affinity with Pisces and does its job very well in Pisces. So Neptune's going to bring good and bad aspects of illusion to anything, but when it's in Pisces or when it goes through that sort of Piscean transit, social media is probably one of the ways in which we can look at Neptune doing its job particularly well, for good and for ill. So going back to drugs, right? So thinking about illusion and disillusion, if we go back to drugs, right? The recent popularity of drugs doesn't have the gritty reality of the heroin epidemic of the 90s, for instance, or the crack epidemic of the 80s. Though modern versions of this with the oxy and meth epidemics come pretty close. When it comes to particularly Neptune and Pisces drugs like psychedelics, we don't really hear a lot of talk about psychedelic-induced psychosis, for instance. Instead, when we listen to podcasts like, the ubiquitous Joe Rogan and all of his kind of acolytes, we get a narrative that just lauds psychedelics as a panacea, as opposed to spending any significant amount of time talking about the opposite end of the spectrum. And those instances where psychedelics, for instance, can take on a really sort of not so great and disillusionary kind of effect. And going back to mysticism as well, right? Look on Instagram for 30 seconds, literally, and you'll see some absolute charlatan proclaiming enlightenment and selling it to you for a fee. And I'm not, I can't really judge a lot of these people that I see on Instagram because I don't typically look at or read or engage with their content too much. But just from the looks of things, I have my doubts that they've been through the agony of spiritual practice and the ordeal of spiritual practice. And I kind of feel like most of them are just after your money, right? So there's that kind of disillusionary kind of quality to Neptune and Pisces if you're open enough to look for it. Likewise with compassion, what we're going to see in the coming years is a lot of discourse from mainstream and alternate mainstream, I guess you'd say, media sources about the tyranny of the weak, by which I mean the ways in which people's compassion can be manipulated and how people can be paralyzed by constant appeals to consider the other. So we can see illusion and disillusion as part of Neptune's modus operandi. And for our purposes in this episode, we're going to focus on how Neptune best presents itself through mythology. So when we think about what myth is, what is a myth? It's a story. It's a reality. It isn't real, but it explains a lot about a culture's beliefs or customs or fundamental facets of human experience in a way that communicates something pivotal and important, but indirectly. So it's not like a textbook. You don't find myths in textbooks, for instance, but you do find myths in fiction. And it's a really Neptunian way of communicating deep and profound truth that doesn't adhere usually to a logical structure. So if you were to try and explain a myth to someone without telling the myth in its entirety, it's really difficult. So let's just think about the boy who cried wolf. If someone's, usually I've got kids, so they ask me things like this. And if they say, what's the boy who cried wolf? I can't really describe what it's about without telling the story and immersing the listener in the experience of the myth in order for them to get it. And getting it is a really important Neptune word, and particularly a Neptune in Pisces word. It's something that is sort of reducible to a vibe, yeah? So if you get it, you kind of get the vibe, but you can't necessarily articulate with a myth the exact purpose or moral in a way that's meaningful. You have to tell the story. So myths occupy a really dim and distant part of our cultural memories. And there's a certain sense of nostalgia that comes with myths, and it's nostalgia that I really want to focus on today. So a legend is something that we kind of yearn for. And personally, I would have loved to have known Merlin and Gandalf, but they're mythic characters, right? They don't exist. And I'm still stuck in this yearning for Arthurian England and Middle Earth because of the way in which those myths are communicated and the worlds that they build and how it feels so real, and yet in the back of your mind that it's not, and yet you yearn for that kind of, to live full time in those sorts of universes where Merlin and Gandalf come from. So that yearning has been particularly pronounced, I think, culturally, aesthetically, and even in a sense politically during Neptune's transit through Pisces. So when we look at other sort of cultural, particularly cultural and aesthetic representations of the nostalgia of Neptune in Pisces, music is a great example. There's a track called Home by Resonance, or Resonance by Home. I can't remember which one it is. I'll link it in the show notes, but have a listen to it, particularly if you're an 80s or 90s kid, and you'll feel deep nostalgia. Even though the song was written in, I think, 2012, it's something that calls you back to a place and a time that has no origin point in reality, and yet in a mythic sense kind of speaks about a legendary time that we all want to return to. And nostalgiagram is a thing as well. 80s and 90s nostalgia accounts on Instagram and Facebook. And now 2000s nostalgia is also a huge thing on social media, and it's very easy to get sucked into going, oh yeah, I remember when that was a thing. Wasn't everything great back then? I'm 42, and so as a result of that, I'm in this nostalgic mindset, but I've seen young people talk in similar terms of the 80s and the 90s, even if they were born in the 2000s. And I think that that's something that's very Neptune in Pisces. So nostalgia is probably the Neptune word par excellence, especially for today. And when we think a little bit deeper, how nice would it be to go back to 2019 or the year 2000 before the pivotal global events that occurred just the following year in both those instances happened? Or how great would it be to go back to the 90s? I think that'd be rad. And when I think about it, my eyes just glaze over and I drift off into this reverie, usually with an internal soundtrack playing, and it's good times. But it's not going to happen. And that's the second part that really hurts deliberately. And that understanding that it's not going to happen is one of the big contributing factors to nostalgia. Okay, so what do we mean by nostalgia? Nostalgia sort of sounds Greek, but there was no such singular word in Greek, which I think is, just as an aside, a very Neptune and Pisces thing. So nostalgia was coined in 1688, incidentally, when Neptune was in Pisces, and it's a portmanteau, it's a compound word. And the first part of nostalgia that comes to us from Greek is nostos, which, like any Greek word, has multiple meanings, but in this context, nostos is taken to mean homecoming. And the second part is algia, from the Greek, referring to pain. And so when you put those two together, you get nostos and algia, or nostalgia, which is the pain of wanting to return home but being unable to. And that's the real message, I think, from today's podcast. So myth and nostalgia and poetry and Neptune kind of lead us to Homer when we think about it a little bit. I recently wrote that piece on my Substack that I'll link to, and in that piece, I talked about Homer and the Odyssey, and particularly that part of the Odyssey where Odysseus confronts the sirens. So just quickly, Odysseus is the main character in the Odyssey. He's the king of Ithaca. And after helping the Greeks win the Trojan War, he wants to go home. But Odysseus has what we would describe these days as a nostalgia for his home in Ithaca. He craves homecoming, he craves nostos. And it's the motivating factor in the myth. It's what propels him to perform all of the actions that he does in the Odyssey. It takes him about 10 years to get home from Troy to Ithaca, and he could walk there in less time, but the adventures that he gets up to and the trials and tribulations that he gets up to are what makes the Odyssey, even now 2,000 odd years after it was written, such a compelling story. One of the trials that Odysseus has to go through on his passage back to Ithaca is to pass by the island home of the sirens. And I think that sirens are very, very Neptunian personally. You know, they live by the water on an island. They're mythic creatures. They're represented in the Odyssey as half bird, half human, although sometimes they're also represented in other myths and legends as half fish, half human, which is even more Neptune in Pisces. Their song that they sing is irresistible. Anybody who hears the sirens' song cannot resist what is contained in that sort of song, in that promise that's contained in the song. But it's irresistible and also deadly. People hear the sirens' songs, and sailors in particular, and they wreck their ships on the shores of the island, and the birds basically eat them. The songs that they sing promise everything. So the sirens themselves promise you the whole world, and they end up delivering nothing. They promise you everything and they deliver nothing or annihilation. And they're also allegedly prophetic. So very, very, very Neptunian, I would say. And the thing that they promise Odysseus that is so irresistible to him are prophetic insights into the Trojan War and the events that will happen afterwards. And this is too good to be true for Odysseus. So he decides to take a detour past their island home, because even hearing the possibility of learning those truths is enough for him. So when I think about sirens in the context of Neptune in Pisces, I can see a couple of examples just in the past 14 years that spring to mind. So drugs and spirituality and social media are the big examples of modern sirens that we have to deal with. So with drugs, it's really nice now that I can go to Chemist Warehouse, which is the Australian, Walgreens or something. It's the big box pharmaceutical and big box pharmacy, basically, is how I describe it. So these days I can go to Chemist Warehouse and get my weed, which is great, rather than going to a dealer's house, which I never really liked, because you've got to have these big conversations with them so it doesn't look sus, and they're always douches. I've never had a dealer that I like. So Chemist Warehouse, infinitely better, right? But looking deeper, isn't it really nice that we can take a pill for anything now, particularly in the past 14 years, and that those pills promise to circumvent the work required to address the root cause of our illnesses? I mean, are you depressed? Don't deal with the issue in therapy, just take an SSRI. Are you overweight or not, and you just want to shed a few more pounds? Don't deal with the root cause of why you feel that way about your body. Just take Ozempic. Can't concentrate? Don't bother putting your phone down and taking conscious control of your ability to concentrate. Just take a dexamphetamine and you'll be good to go. It seems like categorizations of and diagnoses of conditions that just so happen to sell more drugs for pharmaceutical companies have been very much something that's under the microscope since 2011 as well. Thinking about spirituality as another context in which we find sirens these days. Enlightenment is everywhere. You can get enlightenment. Just buy my book or take my course or book in for a reading or do as I say and it'll happen, probably. By the way, book in for a reading with me. I'll put a link in the show notes. Social media is another siren song, obviously, and it's the big one. I can't tell you how much time I've personally lost looking at videos of things that are too good to be true. And the call of the social media sirens is just irresistible, and it's irresistible by design. There are literal armies of engineers working for companies like Google, who own YouTube, and Meta, who own everything except TikTok, who've made it deliberately that way. And that fight for your attention and that quest to distract and divert you so you're just fascinated with whatever it is that they're trying to push through. It's all deliberate and all very much rooted in neurobiology and things like that. So what each of these Neptunian sirens, drugs and spirituality and social media, are promising is an escape from having to do the work. In a sense, they promise an absence of pain and ordeal, an absence of algia, that second part of the word nostalgia. And that's kind of a promise of a return to wholeness, to an ideal or mythic state. Take this pill and you'll return to the mythic state of wellness or health or an appropriate weight or happiness or the ability to concentrate. Take my course or come to my yoga retreat and I will return you to a mythic state of union with the universe, and you'll get Satori for $49.95. There's a kind of homecoming that's baked into these modern siren calls, and so it's a promise of Nostos without the algia, and yet they're all sort of presented in nostalgic terms. And these are examples of Neptune in Pisces and the way that it operates through nostalgia in a contemporary context. But what the fuck are we meant to do about it? So there's a few examples of how old Neptune has been running things since 2011 and how this all fits more or less in a nostalgia-shaped mold. But Neptune is about to switch gears pretty damn soon too, from Pisces into Aries. I think the 30th of March is the date that Neptune ingresses into Aries for the first time. And it goes back and forth for about a year before it gets properly into the driver's seat for Aries. Neptune's still going to do its usual thing of dissolving and disillusioning and illusioning us. But it's going to be geared towards a brand new set of characteristics that are Aries shaped rather than Pisces shaped. So we've actually got an opportunity with this ingress into Aries to get a little bit of Nostos, believe it or not. So to understand more about this, we should probably look at what Odysseus did with the sirens. So in order to get home, Odysseus needs to pass by the sirens. And so to pass by the sirens, he has to do something about the whole hear the song and die thing. And another Neptunian figure, which is the sorceress, Circe, gives Odysseus a solution. She gives him some beeswax and says, use this to plug up your men's ears, because Odysseus is traveling with a band of merry men, most of whom die in the end. Sorry, spoiler alert. But before that, Circe says, here, take this beeswax and plug up your men's ears with these beeswax so that they can't hear the siren's song and they're not going to get drawn into the whole jump overboard and die thing, and they can still row the boat to get you past the shoreline. And as for yourself, Odysseus, strap yourself to the mast, or have your men strap you to the mast of the ship without earplugs so that you can hear the song and get the prophetic truths and get what you want, without falling victim to the song itself and jumping overboard and dying. So Odysseus does just that. He orders his men to strap him to the mast. And when we think about strapping to the mast, what does it actually kind of mean? It means that he has to endure something. He's willingly putting himself open-eared in the path of the siren's song, but strapping himself in so that he's not able to make any decisions or perform any actions while he's literally out of his mind. So if you've ever had to deal with addiction, for instance, which is a very Neptunian word, something that circumvents your rational capacity and compels you with an irresistible call for something too good to be true, whether it's a big win on the pokies or a permanent state of freedom from pain or a deeper intimacy with someone through sex addiction or whatever the fuck tobacco's about, and I'm still trying to figure that out myself, you'll know that trying to kick the habit, whatever it is fucking hard. And the solution, as always, is all too easy. It's just relapse, It's always there beside you, just going, have another cigarette or have another spin on the pokies or whatever it is. In a sense, what Odysseus does is use his rational capacity, which the Greeks called nous or nous, to preempt the ordeal of the siren and then literally straps himself in for the ride. Okay, so he has this I guess, foretelling of what he's in for, which is, this is going to be really insane, Odysseus. So you're going to want to strap yourself in. And he forewarns himself and forearms himself, basically. And this way, and only this way, he can get what he wants, which is those tantalizing prophetic insights into the Trojan War and the events that will follow. And he gets to live to tell the tale. So how does this relate to the ingress of Neptune into Aries? Well, the ingress itself is not going to be a smooth one. There's an immediate conjunction with Saturn, for one thing, which isn't great. It's kind of already happening now, but it's going to get more and more disillusionary because of the combination of Neptune energy and Saturn energy. And when I think about that ingress into Aries and the conjunction with Saturn, it's kind of got the shape of a hangover to me. Like a rude awakening from a dreamlike state. Like a smoke alarm or a fire alarm going off and waking you up from a really pleasant dream. So those siren songs aren't really going to change, but the transition from Pisces to Aries, much like Odysseus's transition from Circe's island to Ithaca, will give us a chance to see what's coming and prepare for the ordeal. In the same way that Neptune made Piscean things like drugs and mysticism and spirituality and compassion and beauty seem glamorous and too good to be true. And honestly, the past 14 years has produced some of the most breathtaking artwork I've ever seen. Neptune in Aries is going to make us feel the same way about Aries things, basically. And that's a bit shit, in my opinion, at least at first. I got nothing against Aries, but Neptune in Aries is going to make us a bit misty-eyed and nostalgic for war, which I'm not really that into, to be honest. So it's not totally war, Neptune in Aries, but a big part of what we'll see initially is war-shaped. And we're about to get a new mythology and glamorization of war, in particular across the next few years while Neptune settles in for the Aries ride. Personally, I'm a pacifist, and I actually think that pacifism is going to fall pretty distinctly out of fashion in the coming decade or so, which isn't great. But we'll eventually get on the other side of the war thing to kick things off, and we'll get the best of Aries with Neptune's ingress and transit through Aries, which is courage and heroism and indomitability and forthrightness and directness, which I really am quite a fan of, just not so much the war stuff. But we're not going to get those before a pretty hefty dose of bloodshed. Personally, I'd rather maintain my nous, my rational capacity, throughout the coming frenzy, and I'm going to assume that you would too. So how do we strap ourselves to the proverbial mast? One way of dealing with this is to plug our ears, and we stop listening to the siren songs of podcasts, not this one, but we stop listening to the siren songs of podcasts that are just feeding you a load of bullshit about Neptunian and Piscean topics. So the danger in all of this, just like the danger that presented itself to Odysseus, is that we abandon reason. We don't want to do this, and it's harder than ever right now, as I'm sure you'll agree, to maintain our sense of reasonable discernment. But because we're approaching the shore of the sirens, we're going to have to deal with that quite significantly over the next couple of months or so. The songs that we're going to hear are deafening, so plug your ears with something so you don't have to hear it. And curiously, in the modern context, plugging your ears is actually unplugging your ears, particularly from social media. Unplug your eyes from social media. Basically, just put your phone down and go outside. Disconnect from the feedback loop. And we get practically everything through our phones these days. Just put them down and maintain strength. And in that sense, you're going to plug your ears to quite a few of the siren songs because they all kind of come through our phones at the moment. And it would make it easier to resist the siren songs that don't come through social media and through your phones and through headphones and what have you, when you do confront them in the real world. There's another way to strap ourselves to the mast, which is to kind of figuratively do it. And when we think about what a mast is, it's something that's upright, even in the choppiest of waters. It's something that has this dependency. It's something that allows us to hook into bigger cycles of experience, just like the wind fills the sails of a mast. So ask yourself, what is upright in your life, even in the choppiest of waters, right? What has proven itself from the past, particularly from pre-2011? Is it a network of loved ones that have always been there for you, like Odysseus's men? Is it a belief system or something unrelated to the novelty of technology, like a religious practice or a spiritual practice that actually delivers tangible goods? Is it a hobby that doesn't need an Instagram profile or a TikTok profile to justify its existence? Is it something that you enjoy doing and disconnecting from the kind of feed, so to speak? And what do you do that isn't online? I think all of those areas are a good place to start to find where the mast is for you and strap yourself to it. Use it as the rigid, upright, motivating force that you can leverage larger forces than yourself with. So a mast has sails and the wind fills those sails, and its purpose is to connect the ship to the wind to power the ship to move forward. If you can find yourself a mast in some of those examples, then it's going to help you to connect to a force that's larger than siren songs, that's larger than the ship that you're in, and it'll help you to navigate and push you through the choppy waters until you get back to safety. And then once you're strapped in, just resist, and know that you've got knots in place that can't be unbound, and rely on your networks. Rely on your teams, just like Odysseus relies on his men. And that's another way to kind of start to recognize and resist the siren songs that we're kind of involved with at the moment and that we're being subjected to at the moment. So if we strap ourselves to our respective masks, we can get what we want from the sirens without losing our minds. And a lot of the modern examples of siren songs aren't literally empty nothingness. They have benefits. Social media has been very good for me, not just professionally, but personally. I've been able to connect with like-minded people in the esoteric community, and a lot of productive, good stuff has come out of it. Like I mentioned before, I wouldn't have known a lot of artists, both musical and visual, without the use of social media. And obviously drugs are good. I enjoy them, but just in moderation. So it's not like the modern siren songs aren't literally empty. There's something that we can get out of it, but the temptation is always to just hit that button a bit too much until we lose our minds. So they're not empty, but they're not all they're cracked up to be, definitely. We can also return home too. We can have our nostos. It's not going to be the nostalgic home of happy memory, because importantly, at the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus gets home to Ithaca, but he still has work to do. During his absence, no less than 108, and that's a very significant number, 108 suitors moved into his house and tried it on with his missus. These suitors were trying to convince Queen Penelope, Odysseus' wife, to marry them. Long story short, he shows up and slaughters them all. But I'd imagine that we're going to find the same thing when we get to wherever Neptune in Aries is taking us. We're going to have some work to do cleaning up, but at least we're going to be in a different place. Probably one that has that same level of nostalgic memory echo, I guess is the only way that I can describe it. Regardless of how it looked, Odysseus still made it back, and he got something maybe not so glamorous, but it was real, and we can move a little bit out of the unreality of Neptune in Pisces into the very real reality of Neptune in Aries. And so I think passing by the sirens is going to be a difficult ordeal, but it's one that you can go through without losing your mind. It's ultimately a hopeful thing if we take Homer as a source of comfort and consolation and instruction on how that could be possible. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed that. Have a think about it, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy, guys. Ciao. Bye.